Hey, it's Brett, and we are continuing They Can't Kill Us All by Wesley Lowery. Much of my job as a reporter consists of desperate and more often than not failed attempts to convince people with no reason to trust me that this is exactly what they should do. My fellow reporter once remarked to me that a reporter deals in the extremes, showing up on what is either the best or the worst day of your life, stepping up to your doorstep to find either elation or pain. We ring your phone the morning after you've claimed the winning Powerball ticket, and we show up, notebook tucked in our back pocket, the day after your mother or brother has been killed. Maybe it was a car accident, or a murder, or a police shooting. How did you find out? And will you tell us more about them? We're so sorry for your loss. Oh, and by the way, do you happen to have a color photo? It's not an exact science. Sometimes those closest to a news story are eager to talk to you and every other reporter, and other times just to one or two lucky souls who happen to show up with their notebook at the exact right moment. Other times, no matter what technique, no number of attempts or approaches will convince someone to submit to an interview, but every reporter works their own advantages, developed by trial and error. I knew immediately which tack I'd take with Netta Elzy, whose trust later became one of my advantages when seeking interviews with other residents and activists. Netta was deeply suspicious of the media, not unlike many of the families and friends of police shooting victims I had encountered before. So often, distrust was matched, if not exceeded, by deep suspicion of the media, and very often that suspicion was born from a moment in their past. And in my experience, a man or a woman who has been burned or betrayed by the media wants one thing: not a correction or a rehabilitative article. They want to be heard, to be able to explain the injustice they believed was dealt to them so that their pain is validated. Netta's personal distrust of the media began earlier that year, just 2 weeks after her mother's death. Sitting on her aunt's couch that afternoon, surfing social media, she saw a Facebook post she didn't think could be true. Rest in peace, Stefan. She got on the phone for another friend. It was true. Stefan Avery Hart was dead. Just 2 weeks after losing her mother, she had lost a close friend. Netta was shattered. They had met almost 5 years earlier when one of her closest friends began dating one of his. As the friend groups began to merge, the two found that they just clicked. First, they'd text each other when their friends were meeting up to make sure the other would be attending. Then they'd make sure they linked up anytime Netta was back in town from school over a holiday. Eventually, Stefan began inviting Netta with him to the highlight of his weeks, Sunday night drag racing in downtown St. Louis. Netta remembers Stefan as a showman, a clown, and who would go out of his way to make everyone laugh as they sat around someone's living room or basement, or when they'd head out to a bar or club or restaurant. He was the friend group's Mr. Fix-It, getting much of his money from working odd jobs on cars and buying old beater vehicles, fixing them up and reselling them. When you talk to his friends now, one of the first things they all recall is that Stefan had a hustle about him. While everyone else had upgraded to smartphones, Stefan was still carrying around an old black flip phone. As long as it rings and I can keep getting my money, it works, Stefan would shout at his friends, who would burst into laughter each time his dated phone would interrupt a hangout. The police in Avery Hart, the police said Avery Hart had fled from a traffic stop, prompting a police chase that included a spike strip and a helicopter. When Avery Hart crashed his car, he allegedly jumped from it and ran away with a gun in his hand. Then, having trapped him in an alleyway, the officers said they saw him raise the gun in their direction. Pieces by local television often mistakenly described Avery Hart as a felon, but his only major crime had been fleeing the police during what had ended up being his fatal encounter. Otherwise, Avery Hart had no criminal record, other than a few unpaid traffic tickets and a misdemeanor marijuana charge. Articles published on the websites of several St. Louis television stations repeated the erroneous charge, and a sea of online commenters called him a thug, a lowlife, someone who deserved to be killed, and whom the world was better without. The comment section was so horrible, Netta recalled as we discussed Stefan's death more than a year later. That was my first time really realizing these racist people from the internet are real life people. This person saying those horrible things about my dead friend could be my neighbor, but Stefan Averyhart had the misfortune of being a black man shot and killed by the police before Ferguson. His killing drew almost no media scrutiny besides the occasional article in the Riverfront Times, a scrappy weekly paper in St. Louis, which continued to follow the case. Avery Hart's mother, Stacy Hill, was sitting at home when she got the phone call telling her that the St. Louis police had shot her only son. The 54-year-old mother had spent her entire life in St. Louis, where she still works at a local grocery store, decorating cakes for birthdays and graduations and funerals. Stefan had been on the way to an auto parts store to pick up supplies for one of his mechanic jobs. His mother still says he should have been a race car driver. So much did he love driving fast from the first time he ever sat behind a wheel. And he was driving fast on that day when the flashing lights pulled up behind him. He had no criminal record, and, his family insists, was carrying his gun legally. But he did commit a crime. He ran from the officers who tried to pull him over. Hill wishes her son hadn't run, but she understands why he did. Black residents in St. Louis all fear the traffic stop. Departments in greater St. Louis are known for using them to milk revenue for the city's bottom line, often stacking multiple violations into a single citation. When tickets go unpaid, a warrant is issued. On the day Mike Brown was killed, Ferguson had almost as many active warrants as it did residents. Stefan Avery Hart had an outstanding traffic warrant. After the first call, Stacy Hill raced to the scene of the shooting. Unable to get answers, she tried the hospital, where workers and security guards wouldn't tell her if Stefan was dead or alive. After several hours, she went home and waited. Finally, she got a call summoning her to the medical examiner's office. Hill was heartbroken, and then she became angry. She read all the headlines calling her only son an ex-con and a felon. Those same articles declared that Stefan had pointed a gun at the officers chasing him, but she just didn't believe it. The investigation would clear her son, she knew it. But few things move as slowly under such a unique cloak of darkness as an investigation into an officer-involved shooting. It was months before she got a call from a St. Louis sergeant in September 2014. The shooting of Michael Brown had thrust all local police departments under public scrutiny. They wanted to give her an update. Hill says she was told that the initial police story was wrong. Her son had never actually pointed the gun. Rather, he was reaching down to pick it up off the ground when he was shot. My son deserved to go to jail that day, Hill still says. He did not deserve to die. Hill begged the sergeant to have the department issue a new press release to correct the record. She asked for the officers' names and was told that those too were unavailable to her. The investigation was ongoing. To date, it still is. She went home and waited. Almost 2 years after that meeting, she is still waiting. For Netta, the pain that pushed her to protest began privately with the deaths of Trayvon Martin and Jordan Davis, as well as the execution of Troy Davis, a Georgia inmate whose appeals of his death sentence became a rallying cry around the same time the story of Trayvon Martin reached its apex. This private feeling of sorrow was compounded by the two police shootings that would define the next years of Netta's life. One of a man, Stefan Avery Hart, whom she knew and loved, and the other man of a man, Mike Brown, whom she had never known. In February 2016, 2 years after Stefan was killed and 18 months after the unrest in Ferguson, I called the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department and asked about the status of the investigation into Stefan's shooting. The department continued to refuse to release the names of officers involved. They also wouldn't give me any other information about why Stefan had been pulled over or why he had been shot. All they would release, in terms of documents, was a 2-page preliminary police report for which they charged me $6. The investigation into the shooting, which occurred 6 months before that of Michael Brown, remains active. I called Stacy Hill back and asked her if she had heard anything else. Sometime in 2015, the captain had called her into the police station and told her he had something to give her. During this meeting, he handed over a more than 40-page case file, which included the same 2 useless pages that I had been given, as well as a full readout of the incident report. The report, which Stacy Hill sent to me via FedEx next day delivery, stated that a St. Louis Metropolitan Police helicopter began following Avery Hart after he fled the traffic stop around 11:50 a.m. on February 12, 2014. After officers deployed spike strips, the report said Avery Hart ditched his car in an alley and began running with a gun in his hand. Not far behind were 2 officers, now pursuing him on foot. As Stefan ran down another alley, he attempted to throw the gun over a tall wooden fence, but he miscalculated the height. The pistol, according to the account of the shooting given by a police officer who was watching from a helicopter, hit the top of the fence and landed back in the alley at Avery Hart's feet. Initially, Avery Hart kept running. Then he paused, turned around, and bent over to pick the weapon back up. At that moment, according to the officer with the bird's eye view, the 2 officers who had been running after Avery Hart rounded the corner, pulled their guns, and opened fire. We could see the detectives draw their firearms and then the suspect fall to the ground, John Furrer, the officer in the helicopter, said in his statement to investigators. Detectives have advised over the radio that shots had been fired. The suspect lay in the alley motionless. So what actually happened in that alley? Did Avery Hart really threateningly raise the gun at officers, or was he in the act of picking it up when the officers ran up on him, got spooked, and opened fire? Will the officers involved be charged? Probably not. And when will Stacy Hill get some of the answers she so desperately desires? It's unclear if she ever will. Much as they did on the last 2 days, crowds had gathered near the street where Michael Brown had been killed and were rallying at the charred remains of the Quick Trip gas station on the evening of August 11, 2014. Night began to fall, and the crowds grew increasingly angry as heavily armored police officers began threatening to deploy tear gas if they did not disperse. After leaving the Brown family's press conference, I had driven across town to meet up with Netta and a handful of other young residents and soon-to-be activists outside the NAACP meeting and asked them to direct me back into Ferguson. Slow down, Netta urged as I whipped my rental car around a suburban side street. Cops around here don't play when it comes to speeding tickets. I probably should have known as much, but it was just my first day in Ferguson. After I parked my car just up the street at the home of one of Netta's friends, we made our way toward the intersection of Nesbitt and West Florissant, where it appeared that about 3 dozen people were squaring off against police officers. I'm under siege, said Donald Harry, the owner of a single-story house that sat at the corner of Nesbitt Street and West Florissant Avenue. Across the street stood dozens of residents shouting at the cops. A block in the other direction, behind Harry's home, stood armored police vehicles and an advancing line of officers. Harry was trapped in the middle of the chaos. The previous night, rioters had shot out the back window of the black SUV that sat in Harry's driveway. When he heard yelling and commotion outside and threatening declarations from the police officers, he got worried and left his house. "I've got my family in here," Harry told me, pointing back to his home. I was jotting down the rest of his sentence when Harry grabbed me, shoving me sideways onto the ground and toward his shrubbery. The police had begun firing tear gas, and while my head was buried in a notebook, I hadn't noticed the tear gas canister that had landed inches from our feet. Soon the corner on which we were standing was engulfed in a cloud of tear gas. Covering my face with the collar of my sweater, I glanced behind me in time to see Netta clutch the top of her chest. "Are they shooting us? Did I just get hit with something?" she screamed. The rubber bullet that had struck her chest was now lying at her feet. We both started running back to the car. "I was just trying to get to my sister's house," cried one 23-year-old who lay sobbing on a lawn. He said he was walking home when officers approached him, sprayed tear gas in his face, and peppered him with rubber bullets. His friends pleaded with an ambulance to hurry, and a neighbor offered to drive him to the hospital. "I don't need a hospital," the man yelled. "This is my home." The police aggression only further incited the crowd, with some lying in the street with hands in the air. "Don't shoot," they chanted. Others added, "Go home, killers." Others fled, crying out for water as stinging tear gas bit at their eyes. While many residents of Ferguson had been deeply outraged by the violence and shooting of the previous night, what upset them even more was the nightly militarized response of law enforcement. These suburban families weren't used to seeing officers in riot gear, which further ingrained the image of a hostile occupying force in the minds of residents whose support would have been vital for the police to maintain order. As the night wore on, residents who remained outside began to regroup. Many refused to leave the streets. Others were physically incapable. As police moved up West Florissant, many residents said they were trapped. The neighborhood consists of a series of cul-de-sacs with one main road stretching between them, and each one was now blocked by police. After running to the car for a bottle of water, I decided, despite Netta's warnings, to move back up toward the tear gas to see what was going on. As I made my way up the street, I ran into 25-year-old Edward Crawford. "This is beyond Mike Brown. This is about all of us," Crawford told me, insisting the reason he had just come into the streets was because he had previously been the subject of traffic stops and searches and had felt he was harassed by Ferguson police because of the color of his skin. A young father who worked as a waiter, Crawford had joined the protest not long before the tear gas and rubber bullets were deployed. "The looting was wrong, but so is this. This is excessive force," he said as a tear gas canister landed just behind his feet. As I made my way back to my car for the final time, I ran into Crawford again. 2 nights later, he and I would both be thrust into the national narrative. I would sit in a cell in the basement of the Ferguson Police Department. Crawford would again join the protest, this time wearing an American flag tank top and eating a bag of chips. He would race to a canister of tear gas fired on the protesters, and in an act captured by the camera of a Post-Dispatch photographer, Robert Cohen, toss it through the air back to the police officers. The image went viral, perhaps becoming the single most recognizable symbol of the Ferguson unrest. But tonight, Crawford was no symbol and he was no hero. He was just a scared resident who was convinced that this aggression from police might never stop. "You're going to write your story and you're going to leave town and nothing's going to change," Crawford told me as the late hours of Monday turned into the early hours of Tuesday. "One day, 1 month, 1 year from now, after you leave, it's still going to be fucked up in Ferguson." Based on the early media coverage, there appeared to be little, if any, effort to distinguish between organic expressions of outrage and pain that manifested in peaceful protest. Both those unplanned and those days later, which were more deliberately organized, and those that boiled over into violence. This was, at least in part, due to our addiction to the exciting, to breaking coverage which emphasizes emotional urgency and sacrifices accuracy and nuance on the altar of immediacy. Buildings are burning, an anchor would declare with little discussion of how circumstances had changed since the last dispatch from what an hour earlier had been a peaceful demonstration. Any person standing on a street was now a protester, whether they were part of an organized demonstration or just standing on their own front stoop. You could see how it would be easy to assume that these same protesters waving signs and organizing groups and demonstrations were the very same protesters throwing rocks and starting fires, but most often they weren't. As the unrest stretched from days into weeks, it began to gain levels of organization. Several new activist groups, led by time-tested local organizers like Montague Simmons, who worked with the decades-old St. Louis activism group Organization for Black Struggle, and Derek Laney of Missourians Organizing for Reform and Empowerment, as well as by more people, as well as by young people who were relatively new to activism, like local rapper Tef Poe and Tori Russell, who co-founded the group Hands Up United, and Ashley Yates, Larry Fellows, Alexis Templeton, and Brittany Farrell, who were among those who launched the Millennial Activists United, began coordinating acts of civil disobedience, marches, and rallies. The bitter taste of injustice is intoxicating on the tongue of a traumatized people. Organized protest, unlike the half dozen or so nights of rioting, almost never resulted in violence, except for tear gas from responding officers. The momentum seemed to keep growing in the streets, spurred on, in part, by the simple truth that police kept killing people. On Tuesday, August 19th, 25-year-old Kajime Powell robbed a corner store about 4 miles from the site where Brown had been killed. According to the police account, the young man brandished a knife and stole 2 energy drinks and some donuts. Responding officers demanded he take his hands out of his pockets. Powell yelled, "Shoot me!" They obliged. Police said the boy, who had a mystery of mental illness, had come within 3 feet of the officers. Cell phone video later recorded by a witness showed that it was more like 15 feet. Several dozen shots were fired after Powell had already been hit and was laying on the ground. They could have shot him in the ass, they could have shot him in the legs, they didn't have to slaughter him, said Floyd Blackwell, a former mayor of nearby Cool Valley, a 2,000-person city that is nearly 85% black and whose kids attended the same schools as Michael Brown. In late September, a Ferguson police officer chasing a young man behind the community center was shot in the arm, but rumors quickly spread through the streets that it was one young black man, not the officer, who had been shot. Officers had to act quickly to calm an emotional crowd outside the police station, insisting that the only gunshot victim that night had been the officer. But protesters insisted it was just a matter of time before the police killed again. On October 8th, 18-year-old Von Derek D. Myers was shot multiple times by an off-duty officer in the Shaw neighborhood of St. Louis, a racially diverse, middle-class section of the city. Police said Myers, who fired 3 shots at an officer, was armed with a stolen gun that they recovered at the scene. Family members insisted at the time that he was armed with only a deli sandwich. Racial profiling will not stand in our community any longer, declared Pastor Doug Hollis, a cousin of Myers, as he presided over a candlelight memorial at the spot where the man, known in the community by the name was killed. More than 100 clutched rosaries and candles and chanted, "Whose streets? Derp Street," as they released red and silver balloons into the air. "We pray for every young man in this community, dear God," another local minister proclaimed during a prayer a few minutes later, "that he might be safe wherever he walks." The shooting came as hundreds were flocking to Ferguson for Ferguson October, a planned weekend of activism that had been coordinated both locally and nationally. The brunt of the work fell on the Organization for Black Struggle and more, as well as the new groups such as Hands Up United and Millennial Activists United. Ferguson October was designed to show officials that activists had not forgotten about their pursuit of justice for Michael Brown. Given the intense coverage of the case, I was shocked that the investigation had been allowed to linger this long. Late September was now fall, with winter fast approaching. The weekend concluded the weekend included carefully coordinated acts of civil disobedience, but no rioting or violence. Hundreds marched on and occupied St. Louis University. Ministers like Jim Wallace and Cornel West led dozens of clergy onto the property for the Ferguson Police Department and were arrested. Young activists like DeRay McKesson, an educator who had joined the protests from Minneapolis, and Charles Wade, a former fashion designer from Austin, helped plan roadblocks of downtown intersections that they called They Think It's a Game, during which the activists played children's games such as hopscotch and jump rope as they blocked traffic. I'd initially been skeptical of Ferguson October. The initial protests had gone on for weeks, and it was hard to believe that these activists, many of whom had never organized demonstrations or protests before, would be able to replicate the direct action protests before, would be able to replicate the organic emotions that radiated from the crowded streets during August. But the Myers shooting had sparked a new sense of urgency. Myers' name was now being chanted along with those of Michael Brown and Kajime Powell. While it would take months to sort out a full official version of what had happened, much of St. Louis's black community already knew everything they needed to know. Another black man had been killed by another white police officer. A dreadful anticipation had gone for months, hanging thick in the air. The grand jury waiting game had stretched for months, and even those of us among the press who had stayed in Ferguson for weeks eventually departed. By early November, with rumors of an impending decision, the media, myself included, has started showing up again. Each day was another countdown toward the inevitable. Darren Wilson was not going to be charged with the crime for the shooting. The city would likely break out into another round of chaos, and it would all be covered wall to wall on cable television. Netta Elzy and many other activists who had been anointed by leaders of the protest by the national media had grown noticeably weary of all the anticipatory coverage. Almost every night, there was some sort of demonstration, often often either outside the Ferguson Police Department or in the Shaw neighborhood of St. Louis where Myers had been killed, and it wasn't uncommon to find the most recognizable and best known of the local organizers screaming at the horde of media cameras to move back so actual protesters could take spots closest to the police line. At one point, Netta and several other prominent protesters decided to sit out the ongoing pre-announcement protest, arguing that it wasn't worth it to spend their nights outside in the cold on evenings when cameras outnumbered protest signs. Meanwhile, they kept getting calls from reporters like me with who in their frustration continued to ask the same slew of questions. What's going to happen if there's no indictment? Are you worried about violence? We just had coffee with like 34 reporters, Netta told me one afternoon in November, about a week and a half before the grand jury decision would be announced, as the full force of the national media began re-arriving on the ground. There are a few reporters who all read their stories and just, she said, trailing off. All it takes is one bad reporter or one reporter who just constantly works to make police look better to make me leery of talking to all of the reporters from that same newspaper or station. And as is often the case with competitive stories, media saturation bred frustration and at times unhealthy competition between reporters on the ground. Both local and national media had taken turns getting things wrong, parroting police and protester narratives that were later disproven, and drawing the ire of readers and each other. The national media, many local scribes quibbled, was out of touch with local context and just wanted to make itself the story. And the local media, some of the national reporters contended, was often too cozy with the police and prosecutor and was complicit in most of the deep systemic problems now exposed in the wake of the shooting. Everyone was right to an extent, but in reality, reporters were only lashing out at each other because we were all exhausted. It had been 3 months of unanswered questions, tense overnight reporting assignments, editors demanding answers that we could not provide, and, at all times, the anxiety of knowing that no matter how late into the night the protests went on, we would all have to wake up the next day and do it all over again. That anger toward the national media, particularly cable news networks, peaked in mid-November following a string of erroneous reports declaring that an announcement of the grand jury decision was imminent, only to be walked back hours or days later. Reporters from the larger cities, the economic and political centers, they tend to believe that they are the biggest dogs of all the big dogs, and they tend to be slow to admit that local media has better official sources. Chris King, the managing editor of the St. Louis American, told me. The local black weekly newspaper in November. King spent the months between Mike Brown's death and the grand jury announcement serving as a source and fixer for national media reporters parachuting into town. His information wasn't always right, but he was regularly in contact with police and city officials who were often reluctant to talk to the national press, certainly not on the record. A text message introduction from King could instantly set an out of town reporter up with an excellent source. It's the broadcast that cried wolf crisis, King told me, exasperated by yet another erroneous cable news report that had declared grand jury decision had been released. If cable news said tomorrow morning that the sun is risen, people would walk outside to see if the sun is outside. One afternoon, I showed up on West Florissant Avenue for an interview with Mike Brown's barber and found more television cameras than shoppers at a strip mall up the street from the shooting site. An internet rumor had declared that this was the day of the announcement, causing the number of out-of-town reporters to spike. "Can one of y'all call and find out about the power?" shouted LaWanda Felder, a 20-year-old college student who lives in a nearby apartment building, to the reporters. The power had gone out on one side of West Florissant, affecting hundreds of low-income housing units, so Felder came out to ask the long lines of reporters conducting interviews if they knew what was up. No one did, although I don't know that any of us had really inquired. "They're just here to see if there will be riots," Felder told me, encapsulating the chief complaint many Ferguson residents about the ongoing anticipatory coverage. "But they don't care about the struggles we're facing in our lives. None of them are going to call and see why my power is out." And we'll pick out up one more time to finish this chapter um, soon. And actually, I think I got this. When the news finally broke, we were crowded in the hotel suite that the half dozen or so Washington Post staffers on the ground in Ferguson were using as a makeshift newsroom. It was a one-line alert from Bloomberg News that had just come in after 11:30 a.m. on a weekday just before Thanksgiving. Breaking: the Ferguson grand jury considering charges against Darren Wilson has concluded its work. The alert was a relief because I was ready for it all to be over. The false reports that the decision was imminent, the rumors peddled by conservative news outlets that the black separatist groups were going to be showing up with their assault rifles, the declarations of the liberal blogs that the KKK was going to be in Ferguson, protecting businesses and targeting protesters. Each new report would prompt a wave of emails from my bosses back in DC. Do we have this confirmed? Can we get this interview too? How can we push this forward? Even mainstream outlets like Post and CNN got into the game of fruitless predictions, triggered by sourcing veiled in anonymity. In October, several colleagues and I reported that Ferguson Police Chief Tom Jackson's resignation was imminent. We were wrong. The consensus among the hundreds, if not thousands, of reporters on the ground was that most likely the decision was not to indict would thrust the city back into chaos. There was intense pressure to pinpoint when exactly the news might be coming. Misinformed sourcing was abundant. Local attorneys who claimed to be close to prosecutor Bob McCullough, federal law enforcement officials who claimed to have a real-time handle on the developments in Missouri, despite being seated comfortably at their desks in Washington, D.C., and local congressional offices were all leaking tidbits of information to reporters at local and national outlets, more often spreading information that would prove untrue. But Bloomberg, a financial news outlet, had yet to be wrong. Frankly, the fact that they were the outlet breaking the news that the grand jury had concluded its work led me to believe that their sourcing was solid. I texted a source of mine I had been cultivating for weeks to see if I could confirm it. Ferguson police and city government were hopeless in terms of issuing accurate information. Other than the occasional interview or puff profile, almost no one working on the Ferguson PD actually knew anything about the daily developments in the Mike Brown case, and those who did weren't talking. My best bet, I'd figured early on was in my reporting, was tracking down someone in the county government. The city, the county's elected officials and police would certainly be involved in conversations about how to roll out the announcement, meaning their staffs would all be briefed. And I figured I could charm at least one of those staffers into sharing some of that information with me. So I sent a text message. Is the grand jury concluded? Is an announcement coming today? The grand jury was finished its work and discussion of how and when announcement will be made, the source replied. And then my phone started ringing. The source was calling. The principals, Prosecutor McCullough, County Police Chief John Belmar, the county executive, and their aides were stepping into a meeting to decide what to do. They had given consideration to a plan that would have them announce that only that the grand jury had finished its process and announce at a later date when the decision itself would be released. But the police unions hated that plan. Their officers were working 12-hour shifts and Thanksgiving was fast approaching. If the city was going to burn, they argued, they might as well get it over with before the holiday. When news is breaking, the uncertainty and urgency spark the drive to make the calls and pester the sources needed to confirm details, but also sprout a mentally overwhelming anxiety, a pressure to get it right and get it first. Mostly, I hope, to get it right. Frantically, I frantically paced our hotel suite, sitting down and then abruptly shooting back up to my feet perhaps 100 times that afternoon as we worked to confirm that the grand jury decision was coming. At 1:49 p.m., almost 2 hours after the grand jury had ended its session, my source texted me again. The meeting had just concluded, and a final decision had been made. McCarlo set to announce the grand jury decision at 7 p.m. That could change, the source said. Gov has a press conference at 5:30 ahead of the announcement. It all made sense. Governor Nixon would take to the microphones before the announcement to preemptively urge peace. Then, that evening, with school children safely home, parents home from work, and their teens hopefully home and under the watchful eye, the prosecutor would break the news. I shot a text to a message to a second well-connected local source. This one wasn't quite as well placed as my first contact, but over the course of the months since Ferguson had become a national story, this person had yet to steer me wrong. A response came quickly. The decision was made, and it was coming tonight. Meanwhile, my colleague Kimberly Kindy, whose intelligence and deep sourcing had helped our Ferguson coverage avoid disaster more than once, had her own source confirming what I was hearing. We had 3 people, the magic number, all telling us the decision had been made and was coming that night. One of mine even went so far as to say that the grand jury had decided against an indictment, but we chose to hold back. As cable networks spent hours declaring that an announcement of the decision could come at any minute, we wrote that the decision was expected that evening. We decided early on that we wouldn't attempt to scoop the decision itself. We would wait for the words to come out of Bob McCarlo's mouth. The rest of the day was a blur. We knew we'd have a tight newspaper deadlines made tighter by the decision to announce whether Wilson would be charged that night. And we knew that, one way or another, the streets would erupt. My plan had been to spend the night at the Canfield Green apartment complex, to wait and see if the neighborhood where Mike Brown lived would descend into violence. But as I sat in the car charging my phone, I got a text from DeRay McKesson. He wanted to know where I'd be watching the decision and invited me to a friend's apartment about 10 miles away in downtown St. Louis to watch the announcement with him, Netta, and a handful of other activists. The group I found in the living room of a third-floor downtown apartment building was calm, like a family gathered around the television for the news. After we had settled on watching headline news, but after a while they tired of the tone of questions being asked by Nancy Grace. Eventually, they turned to CNN, and Bob McCarlo began speaking, and McKesson let out a loud sigh. Here we go, Brittany Picknett, then the executive director for Teach for America of St. Louis, who had been actively involved in the protests, had quickly become close with Netta and DeRay. Here we go. And sent each day by either Netta, DeRay, Brittany, or Justin Hansford, a law professor at St. Louis University, the Ferguson Protester newsletter had swelled to a readership of more than 21,000 people, and the newsletter's writers had become masters of the text message alert system they'd crafted during Ferguson October. The news had yet to break, but they were ready. In anticipation of Wilson's not being charged, they had prepared an open letter written primarily by PACnet that they planned to blast out to their subscribers the moment McCarlo made his announcement. In Ferguson, a wound bleeds, the letter said. The results are in, and we still don't have justice. Wilson had not been indicted. They hit send on the letter. I fired off several tweets and then asked each of the activists in the room for their reaction to the news. When I was done typing up the feed for my editors back in Washington, everyone in the room sprinted toward the apartment door to make the drive back to Ferguson. Several miles away, hundreds gathered outside the Ferguson Police Department, some carrying the protest signs that had been held there every day since the one when Mike Brown was killed. Everybody want me to be calm. Do you know how those bullets hit my son? What did they do to his body as they entered his body? Leslie McSpadden screamed at the news as the news was relayed, her husband and other loved ones wrapping her in a tight hug. Burn this motherfucker down, her husband, Louis Head said, began screaming, Burn this bitch down! There were fires in the streets before DeRay, Netta, and Brittany even made it to Ferguson. By morning, dozens of businesses had been torched, Ferguson police cruisers pummeled, and above it all, where the festive streetlights city officials had hung, spelling out season's greetings.